Good evening. My name is Barbara Savage. This evening I want to speak with you about the issue between the federal and state governments on climate change in the U.S. The task of addressing climate change has become partisan. According to Smith and Greenblatt, initially there were mutual interests between both the Republican and Democratic parties, where policies were ensued to deal with the situation. This stance changed during President Obama's administration. Republicans began either dismissing the idea that the climate was changing or arguing that the climate may be changing while not blaming the human activity, including the releasing of carbon and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The modern environmental movement got its start in the 1960s and led to a concerted federal response in the early 1970s. This included the passage of landmark laws regarding air and water quality, as well as the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. Enforcing and expanding environmental policy has since become one of the central responsibilities of the federal, state, and local governments. After nearly 4 decades, environmental protection is the most heavily funded regulatory responsibility in the U.S. The Republicans rejected the international accord to cut carbon emissions that was adopted at the Paris summit and called for less spending on renewable energy and on international programs meant to help communities to adapt to the changes of global warming. A number of communities in the United States are worried about diminished rainfall affecting crops, heat waves, increasingly intense hurricanes, and rising water levels destroying property. Polls have shown that the topic of climate change has become a popular topic and primary concern to the public. In 2016, 64% of Americans were worried about climate change. The federal government is not at the forefront of the climate change. Some states continue to take the lead, but they are limited in their ability to address a global issue. States lack specific mandates and resources to do more. Enforcing and expanding environmental policy has become one of the central responsibilities of the federal government and increasingly state and local governments. EPA is the most heavily funded regulatory agency with responsibility in the U.S. And based on the federal government's reluctance to regulate the greenhouse gas emissions, environmentalists petitioned the EPA to use its authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate the gases. EPA denied it had such authority, but this was later overturned by the Supreme Court. California's state government, rather than the federal government, emerged as a leader in addressing climate change-related policies. California stepped into this policy arena not simply because of its green-leaning political constituencies or its large economy or its role as a national cultural trendsetter. California will become a petri dish for international efforts to slow global warming. In 2016, California became the only state allowed to set air pollution controls, stricter than those mandated by federal law. Through the Clean Air Act, California occupies a unique policymaking niche in the federal system. Other states began following California's lead, but their biggest obstacle is federal government. Cars are not the only source of greenhouse gas emissions. In 2016, Fran Favely and other California lawmakers worked successfully for the passage of a piece of legislation known as AB 32 that sought to address the stationary sources of pollution such as power plants, oil refineries, and cement plants. The law aims to reduce industrial carbon dioxide emissions by 25% by 2020. AB 32 represents the first imposition of statewide enforceable limits on greenhouse gas emissions that includes penalties for non-compliance. The legislation was the first in the nation to require a cap-and-trade system to address greenhouse gases. Despite the absence of federal government's participation and legislation for climate change, many states, cities, and counties have in recent years adopted various climate change policies, while some of the neighboring communities have rejected or scaled back on climate change. In the last two modules, we noticed the state and local governments' dependence on financial resources from federal government. In this week's module, we notice a similar pattern. The federal and state government continue to have feud over decisions that require financial support. The federal government has a mixed record in dealing with climate change. This issue has played into partisan politics. My recommendation is for other states to follow in the footsteps of the state of California to create policies in climate change. The Environmental Protection Agency was mandated to create rules to protect the environment. States must hold the EPA accountable. They must continue to push federal government ultimately to obtain resources to improve the lives of citizens in their constituents. Like the state of California, states and local governments have limited resources. Yet, despite this limitation, the state of California continues to push its mandate for climate change. California did not allow financial resource to deter its process in climate change. While the government is dragging on its decision to create legislatures to protect the environment, more and more states are adopting the changes that California has made regarding climate change. States should form an alliance with each other to create climate change policies and not be deterred by the federal government's lukewarm reception to climate change. Thank you for listening, and please make your comments on Canvas. Have a good evening.